I have to confess that one of the very best parts of having been the founding pastor of an entirely independent little liberal church is that we just don't have many meetings. During my 30 years as a denominational pastor, I had so many local, state, national, and even international conferences, assemblies, and educational events, many of which were not only expensive, but they were time-consuming, and at the end of the event, I often felt that I had wasted time and money for something that amounted to little more than balloon juice. But the mere fact that I don't attend them anymore doesn't mean that such meetings do not go on without me. David and I came upon a report from this fall's Congress of World Religion Leaders in Kazakhstan to be of sufficient interest that we are devoting our next few sermons to addressing one of the resolutions drawn up there. The conference was addressing that very basic question of what faiths of all sorts have to offer to a world that is clearly suffering from many different crises all at once. Now, this is actually something that David and I talk about on a nearly weekly basis for years now. A generation ago, it seemed to me that the world's devotion to religions that express themselves in forms of magical thinking, superstition, and rituals were giving way to a new and more rational view of faith, primarily focused on ethics. However, whether it was due to the pandemic or the rise of fascism around the world, it seems more like the process is now in reverse. Rational, philosophical approaches to faith appear to be, at least numerically, in rapid decline, and embarrassingly irrational and superstitious religion is stronger than ever. I hardly know how to express my personal disappointment in this development, but the fact of our decline is reinforced every Sunday morning when I drive to our little gathering here in Springfield. I drive past mega churches with full parking lots where thousands of our neighbors gather to sing highly repetitive and fairly vacuous songs while waving their hands in the air and engaging in glossolalia, what they call speaking in tongues, an almost certain sign of an abandonment of all critical thinking and facts in favor of an otherworldly emphasis on a supernatural theistic world which, if you are honest about it, obviously does not exist. I have consoled myself for years with the awareness that we have thousands of listeners around the globe, even if our local congregation has always been small. But since the pandemic began, we have become very small, and the Flat Earth Society, meeting under various denominational monikers, seems to be unfazed. I have woefully concluded that the world does not much seem to want progressive theology or moral philosophy, but that doesn't mean that the world doesn't need it. This fall's Congress of the Leaders of World Religions bluntly called our current state of affairs a tumbling world. This current European war looks so much like the beginnings of the world wars from early in the last century. Only now Russia's pathological land theft from Ukraine not only threatens to pull Europe, the United States, and China into the conflict, but there is the added threat of either nuclear war or, worse, a nuclear accident resulting from the sloppy deployment of conventional weapons. This is creating a refugee crisis, adding millions of people to the already huge displacement from other regional conflicts and from the growing ravages of climate change, which will see millions of more people having to move to where there is water and the possibility of agriculture. There's also a huge increase in malnutrition because the grain harvests in Ukraine are being prevented from being distributed to the nations that depend on those shipments, mostly nations in Northern Africa and the Middle East. Things have been so bad in Europe and the Middle East for the past 9 months that the North Korean dictator, Kim Jong-un, has had to resort to firing lots of intercontinental missiles just to get some media attention and remind us all that Vladimir Putin isn't the only dangerously reckless world leader. We were already in the midst of rapid economic changes in the West with the growing advent of automation, lowering the market value of labor when the pandemic began. But the pandemic has accelerated the pace of change, making unskilled labor in an ever more vulnerable situation, made palpably worse by the onset of global inflation. Inflation is an inconvenience to the economically well-situated and a crisis that creates homelessness and food insecurity for millions of people at the bottom of the economy. It is precisely this sort of crisis that historically fuels the public's appetite for otherworldly religious beliefs. We have literally seen this happen for centuries. Philosophers, particularly in the East, began predicting the end of supernatural theistic religions as early as the 5th century before the Common Era. But something always happens to increase despair about the future of this world, and that makes a fearful public double down on religions that promise deliverance in an invisible, albeit non-existent, afterlife. Shortly after our own Revolutionary War, in which Americans sought independence, the French had a revolution to establish reason as the new religion of the modern age. They destroyed religious art and symbols and turned cathedrals and churches into temples of reason. They portrayed reason as a goddess, in part to thumb their noses at the traditionally male monarchy, but there was also a certain subtle slap at the moralism of the church by depicting her with bare breasts, because it was popular among French prostitutes of the time to give themselves the names of Greek goddesses. The French have a none too obscure love of iconoclasm. But this shift in beliefs among thought leaders in France was not unfamiliar to the founders of the United States. None other than George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, they were all deists, believing that the only divinity in the world was our collective human wisdom. It seemed at the end of the 18th century that abusive power of organized religion was being rejected, along with all the neurotic guilt and prejudices it fosters. The French and American revolutions were signs of hope in the future, a more free and scientific age that would ameliorate poverty and suffering. However, both revolutions failed to deliver on those promises. Liberation from the monarchy and the church did not equate to liberation from the ravages of poverty caused largely by capitalism. Supernatural religion continually enjoys rebirth after rebirth in the desperation of people who have lost all hope in this world. Thomas Jefferson famously predicted that by the end of his lifetime, traditional forms of religion would have become extinct, and maybe they would have if people like Thomas Jefferson had not been such a slave-owning and slave-raping classist narcissist. But I will not take your time to delve into that today. I am personally a part of the tail end of the baby boom. My generation came into being following World War II, a time of economic expansion and a time when fascism had been defeated and seemingly permanent national boundaries had been drawn, hopefully bringing to an end all traditional warfare. The defeat of the Nazis and the fascists and the relative détente that we enjoyed with communism was sealed by my generation being forced to say a newly revised and made religious pledge of allegiance to the flag that was to continue to reinforce our patriotism and devotion to an American way of life. We sang the national anthem at baseball games. We prayed at football games, every meeting of the Kiwanis Club, the Lions Club, the Optimists. Even Sunday mornings, when I was a child, we had an opening assembly before Sunday school. Everybody gathered together in one place, and we said a pledge of allegiance to the flag, and we sang the national anthem. We were raised to be unthinkingly devoted to America, its Constitution, its values of democracy, freedom, and equality. Personally, I didn't like it. I think I was about 14 years old when I put two and two together and realized that the Pledge of Allegiance was supposed to be a solemn promise to unquestioningly participate in whatever crazy war our American corporations tried to get us into. And even as a young teen, I could see the moral weakness of our military involvement in Vietnam. I recognized early, and my awareness of my nation's moral failings were sealed the summer that I spent most of the day watching the Watergate hearings, that America had great but unrealized goals. I think that I was patriotic so far as democracy and freedom went, but I wasn't crazy about the institution that claimed control of the ship of state. But nothing prepared me for the reemergence of fascism in America. I watched in stunned belief almost 2 years ago when an American president organized a coup to overthrow the government of which he was the head. Thousands of violent fascists stormed and defiled the Capitol building in an attempt to overthrow democracy, to do away with liberty and freedom and such basics as majority rule. And now, 2 years later, our nation seems to be paralyzed in a moral quandary, unable to criminally charge and put on trial the people who nearly destroyed the oldest democracy in the world and who now, quite publicly, plan to organize better and try again. My casual search for a quiet tropical retirement haven has taken on a certain sense of urgency now that I am no longer certain that our constitutional democracy will survive the challenges it now faces. Of course, assuming that I might live for another 20 or 25 years, I'm going to have to find a tropical island paradise that won't be swallowed by rising sea levels before I meet mortality in person. But if I'm honest about it, escaping America's problems by retiring to the tropics is actually terribly similar to the people who escape from the challenges of life by embracing magical religious beliefs. The tropics offer a better climate, a beach, scuba diving, and a whole array of fruit-flavored rum drinks, but still it's escapism, isn't it? Rather than accepting the defeat of rational religion and either running away or falling into the arms of a mind-numbing superstitious religion, can we try once again to enthrone reason as our religion? As David will be touching on in the next couple of sermons, traditional religion is often one of the things that divides us and is at the root of a lot of what is wrong with modern society, as seen just this past week in the violent attack in the gay bar in Colorado Springs. A lot of fear, prejudice, hatred, and suspicion have religious origins for which we must apologize, but at the very least, progressives need to reform our own camp to eradicate such religious prejudices from the world. But there's also a fundamental connectedness to progressive spirituality, a connectedness that is not fearful of immigrants or refugees, that is not nationalistic, seeking always to expand the boundaries of empire, either by political control or by economic domination. In the early part of the 20th century, the British philosopher Bertrand Russell realized that with the advance of communication technology and the advent of easier and more affordable global travel, that people who had formerly minded their own business because of distance and geography were now rubbing up against each other. And through sheer contact, there was increasing suspicion, hostility, phobias about the differences of other people. So even before the internet, before there was a Facebook or TikTok or Twitter, Russell realized that closer contact would result in more aggression, more territorial wars, and levels of ideological purity. A century ago, he advised us, love is wise, hatred is foolish. In this world, which is getting more and more closely interconnected, we have to learn to tolerate each other. We have to learn to put up with the fact that some people say things that we don't like. We can only live together in that way. If we are to live together and not die together, we must learn a kind of charity and a kind of tolerance which is absolutely vital to the continuation of human life on this planet. Now, Bertrand Russell would certainly have not suggested that we need formal religion to teach that kind of charity and tolerance. If you can't tell the difference between what's right and what's wrong, you are not necessarily in need of religion, you are in need of a conscience. I'm proposing that spirituality, spiritual communities, are one answer, a part of an answer, not the only answer, but at least a part of an answer to helping a world that is tumbling, literally falling apart, to undergo a revolution that is about freedom and democracy and equality and justice. We don't need heaven or hell, souls, demons, or angels. And forgive me for saying it this bluntly, the last thing the world needs is more belief in an imaginary friend in the clouds. But we do need more tolerance, more understanding, more compassion, and maybe we can even work our way up to having more love. I hope that spiritual communities will survive to promote this kind of rational religion. The shelf life of traditional religions has surely gone way past their best if used by date. That's just my opinion, but I suspect you all know that I'm right.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.